Remember, audience, please engage with him on discussions.
Hi everyone, my name is Vishal Biyani. I'm CTO and founder of InfraCloud Technologies. I'm also a Fission maintainer and I'm pretty active organizer of Kubernetes Pune, so would love to connect you there. Cool. So today we are going to talk about building event-driven applications on Kubernetes with Fission. Now, before even we go there, I think the first question that comes to your mind may be, why care about function as a service platform on top of Kubernetes when we have cloud provider, managed function platforms? I think there are some use cases and there are some scenarios where I think the FaaS and Kubernetes really shines, and we'll walk through some of those scenarios. So today, if you look at developers, they develop functions, they develop microservices, they develop source code, they also build Docker images. Will it not be nice to have a consistent way to deploy and not worry about the underlying runtime or not worry about what platform I'm deploying to all of these artifacts? So today, I think the developer's choice pretty much is clear. We want to deploy all these things onto Kubernetes in some form or fashion. And this Kubernetes could be sitting on top of other cloud, one cloud, or on-premise bare metal machines. But as a developer, I don't want to worry about what is the underlying platform. I want to worry about the code. I want to worry about how much value I can deliver, with my applications. So one thing is consistency of being able to deploy different types of workloads, right, from functions to microservices, and then not compromising on the underlying things like scale or operability, or being able to scale as the demand grows, and then being able to scale down when the demand kind of vanishes. The second factor, I believe, when we develop all these different applications, whether it is services or functions or using Docker images or source code, I want to integrate with them, with a bunch of systems. It could be a message queue system. It could be a database. It could be a monitoring system. And I want to write all these integrations as a developer without having to worry about how do I connect to this? How do I make it work? That is one part. The second part is I don't want my workers to sit idle when there are no messages or no events happening in my message queue, for example. I want the workers to be spinned up only when there is some event. Consume those events. Once the consuming is done, processing is done, shut down the number of processors back to zero, maybe, right? So I think something like that will be really ideal for developers. Apart from these two key factors, I think a lot of times you also want the control of the underlying infrastructure. What is the operating system? What are the patches running? Are there any security issues? And stuff like that. You also want a fine-grained scaling control. For example, being able to scale out or scale in as required. And you don't want any timeout or any other limits onto how do you run these functions or microservices, whether on cloud, on premise, with a similar experience. And I think one key point you might have noticed in all of these is the developer productivity. How do we make sure as a developer we are productive, we are able to deploy things, build things fast without having to worry about the underlying infrastructure and just scale out, on demand. Now, we talked about why FaaS and Kubernetes matters, but I think there are some scenarios where you shouldn't probably think about FaaS and Kubernetes, and let me call them out very clearly. So, for example, if you're doing only a few hundred invocations, of a function per day, it doesn't make sense for you to maintain the Kubernetes cluster, the rest of the machinery to make that happen on top of that. So anything at a very small scale, I would really not use Fission or any FaaS platform, on top of Kubernetes. I would simply go with cloud provider provided, managed like function services. Uh, Also, there are a lot of companies which start small, let's say a couple of engineers together. You start with a single cloud. You don't really worry about multi-cloud and those kind of things, right? That is not a point at which you should be thinking about a FaaS platform on top of Kubernetes. I would really use as many as possible cloud managed services and scale my business, early on and not think about all these factors very early in my business. Also, workloads which are very static or workloads, which are not driven at all. I think FaaS on Kubernetes is not a great candidate, and I would rather use managed services from cloud providers. Great. Now, having looked at FaaS and Kubernetes, why it matters and why you should worry about it, and when you should not really use it, let's talk about Fission. So Fission is a FaaS platform on top of Kubernetes. It's a simple and easy to use platform for developers. You can write code or you can provide Docker images. Either ways, the concepts of Docker and Kubernetes can be abstracted from the developers. You can expose them if you want, but as a general rule, if you don't want to worry about Docker or Kubernetes or building Docker files, all that is abstracted out from you. We maintain something called as a warm pool. It adds a latency of 100 milliseconds, but it gives you the benefits of not being able to or not consuming the entire infrastructure when there is no load on the infrastructure, so to speak. And there are a bunch of other things, right, from how it is integrating with event sources and bunch of things like that. We'll look at in a couple of slides. So while we are here, here is a framework which makes developers' job super easy. I would love if you can go to GitHub Fission and start the project and definitely follow us. Cool. So let's understand what Fission can do for you as a developer. How does it work? What all it supports? What you can do with Fission. So the first thing is Fission sits on top of Kubernetes. So Kubernetes is the platform you absolutely need for running Fission. We also very heavily use a project called KEDA. It's a Kubernetes event-driven autoscaling, that is a long form, and it allows you to integrate with a bunch of sources, message queues, databases, and whatnot. Now, as a developer on Fission, you can write functions. You can also write microservices. You can provide source code, or you can provide Docker images. Irrespective of what you provide, the way you build, deploy, and then execute and run that is consistent from your point of view. Now, it also supports a bunch of languages, right? From Java to Golang to Python, Ruby, Perl, .NET. So you can write in any language that you want, and the experience is more or less consistent across all these language platforms. Now, once you've written a function or a microservice in any of these languages, you ideally would want to call them, right? So you can call them using HTTP, or you can call them using cron job kind of parameters. So you can say every hour or every minute, this function or this microservice gets called. But you can also call them using bunch of event-driven, sources. So you can use any of, Amazon Kinesis or NATS or Azure Event Hub or Kafka or Redis. Anytime something happens in any of these data systems, you can say a function should get triggered or invoked, basically. But I think one of the most important factors is when you're operating a complex platform like Fission and Kubernetes, you need absolute details as to what is happening if something goes wrong. And that's where we really, integrate well with all the underlying observability systems, whether it is Prometheus or Elastic or Jaeger for distributed tracing or Grafana for visualization and, alerting, basically. Cool. Now, having looked at, why FaaS matters, having talked about what Fission does, let's dive into the code and, let's get some stuff running. So I'm going to do quick two demos. The first one is a simple hello world. So you get a sense of how Fission works, what it does, and what a hello world looks like. So let's go right there. So first of all, I'm going to create an environment, which is nothing but the underlying runtime for any function. Secondly, I'm going to use a simple hello.js piece of code and create a function. Now, what does this hello.js do? Let's take a quick look. So hello.js is nothing but a simple Node.js function. It is returning a hello world and a status code of 200. It follows a specific syntax when it comes to function, but it's relatively simple in terms of the logic. Good. So now we have the function, we have the environment running. Let's test it out. I'm just going to do Fission function test and hello.js, and let's see how it works. Great. Here is our hello world. Now, of course, hello world is great, but we need something more concrete, something more realistic, so to speak, right? So I'm going to do another small demo. Let's say I have a producer function. It is producing messages. This could be anything. This could be your IoT device. This could be your, POS applications which are generating events, and those events are getting dropped into a Kafka topic. Now, as soon as there's a message in the Kafka topic, I want another function to be invoked called consumer. This consumer function is going to invoke messages or consume messages from your topic and process them. If it is able to successfully process them, it will put the response back into another Kafka queue called response. But for any reason, it is not able to process, there is some error, there is some exception, it is going to put that into another queue called error. So you can separately process them later. Now, one good thing I want to call out here again is when you're listening to Kafka, messages coming into Kafka topic, I don't want X number of workers to be always running and listening to Kafka topic. What I really want is there is no pod running or no application running. Only when messages arrive, those pods are horizontally scaled out and actually delivering messages. So let's go and see how this is going to work. Now, if you look at the bottom half of my screen, there are two functions I have. One is the consumer function, which is what I was talking about, the consumer side of story. And then there's a producer function, which is actually going to produce these messages. What connects both of these and the Kafka topic is something called as a MQ trigger, a message queue trigger. So the name of the message queue trigger is Kafka test. It is going to invoke a function called consumer, and the type of message queue is Kafka. It is going to listen on the request topic for any messages arriving. and it is going to send all the messages which are processed successfully to response topic, and any errors that happen, they are going to get sent to error topic. It's also going to try 3 times before it decides to put anything in the error queue, and you can look at also lastly the content type of application or the messages basically. Now, before we go and actually execute this, and I show you the processing of functions, let me actually go and show you the code of all this. So producer function. Now, producer function follows a simple protocol. It uses a handler method. It's a Go program, by the way, and it has a certain argument that it needs. All it is doing is connecting to your Kafka message queue and processing those messages. And there are about 1,000 messages we are going to produce and put into a Kafka queue. And once it is done, it is going to exit. The function is going to exit and done its job basically. Now, once the messages have arrived in Kafka queue, it is going to get picked up by another component, which is going to call the consumer.js function. And consumer is doing not a lot. It is just picking up the message that it received from the Kafka queue, and it is printing it out that, hey, this is the response, so to speak. That's all there is in terms of functions. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to invoke the function producer, so it is going to produce 1,000 messages. But before I go there, I want to show you something important. So as you can see right now, in the default namespace, I don't have any pods. Once I start producing messages, what I'm expecting is there are pods which are created on the fly, which will actually start consuming messages from my Kafka queue. So let's put them on the watch mode. In the second window, now I'm going to call my producer function. So this producer is going to produce now about 1,000 odd messages, and we'll see 2 things happening. One thing is that more pods will be created here as the messages start arriving. Now, as you can see, 1 pod has been created for consuming these messages, and it is running in state. And if I look at the logs of that pod, I can see it is producing about, or it is consuming, the 20th or 21st messages. Now, right now, it is only 1 pod running, and it is consuming the early set of messages. But as it realizes there are more messages than a single pod can handle, this is actually going to auto scale. So right now we see only 1 pod, and we'll see in a couple of seconds or maybe a minute, couple more pods getting spinned up and consuming all the messages that are getting written by the producer in our case. All right, so that's a very quick and simple demo. What we can do is we can let the auto scaling happen here, and we can come back and watch it a little later, and we'll continue for the rest of the presentation and talk through other things. Great. Another example, that is again available on the GitHub repository of Fission. We actually use a 6 set of functions. One of them is a Kafka producer, very similar to our producer that we just saw right now, that produces messages, put them in a Kafka queue. And then there are about 6 other functions. One of them is the consumer. The consumer basically picks up messages from Kafka, does some massaging of the data, and puts them into Redis. The other 4 functions really read Redis data and provide it as an API endpoint. And the last function is the web function. It basically queries the API endpoints and show you all the nice statistics. Now, I'm not going to run this. It'll probably take another hour for us to try it out and show entire code and the working. But you can go and check it out on this repository. And there is also a screenshot and a demo of this working in live basically. Cool. Let's go and see if there is more messages or more pods getting produced. Right. I think it is still consuming about 235 odd messages. If it finds more than 1 consumer group, it will probably scale out. But if it doesn't, it may not scale out. And I don't know which way I have configured it right now. But you get the gist of this. Once these 1,000 messages are consumed, the pod that is running Kafka test is going to get shut down, and it is going to get back to 0 state. So that is a truly elastic infrastructure that you can scale out and scale in as per your requirements, and still able to build event-driven applications which react when there is an event and which don't react when there is no event, so to speak. Great. Now, one thing I would like to talk about is contributing, not just to Fission, to any open source project. And I want to bring a personal anecdote, from my journey of open source. So I really started my career into the enterprise software. I was a mechanical engineer by education, so most of what I did was, learning on the job in my early years of, software engineering career. I worked with enterprise companies, not a lot of open source. Of course, I did use open source like Java and other things, but most of the things that I did or that I work on were closed source and driven by commercial companies. I think around 2010, 11, I discovered a project called Cloud Foundry. It was a PaaS platform, very promising and very interesting, probably ahead of its time. And I discovered the value of open source software. I could download the entire stack, I could run it on my machine, try it out, fix a bug, fix the documentation, send something back upstream. So I joined GitHub, as any developer would do back in the day. I think the early years of my GitHub and general open source activity was still, watching from the sidelines, see what is happening. Maybe look at a few projects, maybe raise a few issues if you try out something, maybe raise a small documentation patch, maybe fix one word here, one word there. But I was really happy, I could contribute in my own small ways, in my own tiny ways to open source. Over time, I took small baby steps. So I created a Salt Stack workshop. Basically, I learned Salt Stack as part of my work. Salt Stack is again, another open source configuration management tool. And I realized there is not a single demo out there where you can spin up, 3 boxes of Vagrant on your own machine and play around, with Salt the way you would do with a very realistic kind of, application or demo. So I built out a small utility, put that out in the open source. I talked about it to a couple of my colleagues, my friends, and they were really happy that, they could actually clone it, up it, and they could actually start playing with Salt. So this was a great satisfaction, from giving back to community and making somebody's learning easy. And around 2017, I started with Fission. I didn't know Golang, for example, when I started with Fission, I learned it on the job. I started contributing with small features, small documentation patches, small bugs. Over time, I started contributing bigger and bigger features, and eventually, I'm maintaining the Fission project as of today. So I want to say, don't think, that you have to start big. Don't think that you have to do everything, right from the beginning, very big. Start small, start helping in smaller ways you can. Eventually, you will reach a point, where you'll start contributing in bigger and bigger ways. Now, as far as Fission is concerned, you can go to Fission, docs.fission.io/docs contributing, and build code on your machine and see how it is working. If you run into any issues, please join Slack. You ask questions to contributors, other community members. They're very happy and friendly to help others. Also, there is another project that I'm kind of practically quite involved into is called BotCube. It's a chatbot for Kubernetes. Works on top of Microsoft Teams, Mattermost, Slack, bunch of chat platforms. And again, very nice project to start contributing, make small changes, understand infrastructure, understand systems, and so on and so forth. Cool. Let's see and go, if our pods have scaled out, our messages are still consuming. Okay, so we are about 715. I don't think it did scale out because there's probably only one consumer group. But if I had more than 1, 2, 3, 4 consumer groups, then it would have scaled like 3, 4 pods and consumed all the messages. And you can see by probably in a couple more minutes, 1,000 messages will be consumed and done. And the pod will be shut down, the one that was consuming messages. So great. That's a simple demo. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them on the GitHub discussions as well. But thanks for listening to me patiently.
Veerji, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਨਾਲ ਰੌਣਕ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਆਏ ਹੋ. You have brought in a lot of energy, a lot of shine in our GitHub Satellite event. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Thanks, Mohit, for the opportunity. I'm happy to be here.
Celebrating and a big shout out to all our community in north of India. Folks out there, make some noise, share with us on Twitter, #GitHub Satellite. Thank you. The session was really awesome. Let's jump to the questions now.
Yes, Vishal, we got questions for you, and I'll take the first one. How does one build a chain of event functions with Fission?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is a project called Fission Workflows, which allows you to do that to some extent. But also our users, they have actually built out their own custom logic to build a chain of functions. They basically use message queues as a way of orchestrating. So one function produces something, it puts into a message queue, and there is some other function listening to it, and that just builds a chain of functions that you can execute basically.
Awesome. When it comes to Lambda or Azure functions, like when are those better to use as compared to Fission, for example?
Absolutely. I think for anybody who is new in general to computing, or let's say, FaaS, I would highly recommend them using Lambda or, Azure functions. They are a great starting point. They give you a lot of value without having to understand all of the underlying, nuts and bolts of, infrastructure. So I think they are a great starting point. And in fact, I would say even for smaller businesses, early stage businesses, they are great value add. They give you so much power without having to worry about the infrastructure. Only beyond a certain point when you start scaling out, I would really think about FaaS and Kubernetes as a strategy, or if it is going to give me something more than what I get from Azure Functions or Lambda, for example.
That's a great advice for how one should look at transitioning from one stack to another. And we got another one, and you shared a lot about the projects where you are contributing, Vishal, and I think that's led to this. So our audience is asking here, how do I get involved in Fission and start contributing to it?
Sure. I think the first and foremost thing I would do, is go check out the project and try it out. Forget about contributing, but also understand what it does, right? Build a simple function, deploy it, see if it works, right? If you again run into any issues, join the Slack. People are happy to help, and guide you. Once you understood what the project does, then I would go and look at the good first issues on Fission or any repository. I think most of the repositories do follow this standard, and find out a very small issue in the area that you are comfortable with, maybe with a message queue, maybe with a database, maybe something, simple as linting code, for example, right? And start contributing. What that will do is that will give you an idea of the project structure, how to build, how to deploy. Once my first, basic simple bug is done, then I would go and, figure out more complex bugs, smaller features, and get more and more involved into the project.
Thank you. That's a great advice. Any special messaging for, say, our student community out there and early developers? Anything different you would want to suggest them?
Yeah, I think I do advise, a few of my family and, friends who are students. I think start basic, start small, start with a simple language, but definitely go to depth of it and have a lot of attention to detail. And today, we are lucky in 2021, we have so many tools, whether it is a browser-based IDE or, GitHub Actions. We can do so many things without actually having to know and, build everything on your own machine. So I would say pick up one language, get great at it, and beyond that, explore your interests, whether it is into systems or AI or machine learning or big data, whatever it may be, and slowly, steadily, progress with open source projects, because there is so much out there.
Thanks for sharing that. And I wish all of this was available for me as well, as I was growing
Absolutely.
up. So Vishal, you mentioned something very interesting about the Pune Kubernetes and CNCF meetup. Would love to know more on how it started and where it is today. What is your future plan?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a topic close to my heart. I think when Kubernetes was very early and Mesos was still the dominant orchestrator, so to speak, I thought Mesos will take over, but I realized Kubernetes had a lot of power. I started the meetup because there were a few people that we knew about Kubernetes, and we thought it's a good idea to share with broader community, and hopefully more people will join us. So when the first meetup we did, it was just 8 people, including myself. And over time, it has grown to now almost 2,000 people actively in the meetup group, but also 50, 60 joining us every month. We talk about all the basic topics and some advanced topics as well, and learn from each other basically. I mean that's the goal, and that was the original idea, that what I know, if I can share, and others share from their learnings, the mutual learnings will be net together more than what we can do individually.
I'm sure folks here listening in would want to also know how can they join in.
Absolutely. So you just have to go to meetup.com/KubernetesPune. And if you're already a member of Meetup, you just join the group. If you're not, just sign up for meetup.com and join Kubernetes-Pune on meetup.com.
Great. That's great. And this question has been coming up for almost every speaker out here. So there it is for you, Vishal. What's your favorite set of features at GitHub, and what do you use the most?
Yeah, absolutely. If you ask me what is my most favorite one today, it definitely has to be the VS Code on GitHub, where you can open a browser IDE and start developing. I think the other one that I really like is the GitHub Actions, because it gives you a truly integrated workflow, right from source code management to writing code to CI/CD, all in a browser window. So I think the VS Code in browser is my most favorite feature, I must say.
Wow, so it's actually coming really close. Most like code spaces and actions, and that's what we've been hearing from folks as well.
Absolutely.
When it comes to other projects that you contribute to, is this usually in the same area, or do you prefer, like, again, from an advice to others as well, would you prefer to deepen in one area or explore multiple?
Sure. I think in past I tried to do multiple, but I think at least personally from my perspective, what happens is then you spread yourself too thin into too many areas and you don't get depth. I prefer to focus on one area. For example, even if you look at just infrastructure, there are probably hundreds of projects out there, and I don't think you can again contribute to all hundreds of them anyways. So I would really focus on one area, get depth into that, and then choose a few projects that you can contribute to consistently. I believe the consistency over time is a lot more important than contributing to X number of projects. If you're early in your career or you're a college student who still don't know what you want to do, whether system design or big data or machine learning, it's okay to explore. It's okay to be a little open. But at some point, you have to take a call and say, hey, I'm going to focus on this one area and consistently spend my time over, let's say, next couple of years.
That's great. That's great advice, and definitely very, very useful for all our audience. And Vishal, with that, we'll wrap up the question and answers here. But for our audience, you're going to hang around in the discussions room with them for next 30 minutes. So everybody out there, do catch him for all the amazing work that he's doing. Learn from him his experiential knowledge, especially about how to contribute and getting started with the open source projects. With that, bye Vishal, and we will see you in the GitHub Actions room. Leave you there with all our audience.